Hey, we got a special guest joining us here. Although he did kind of big-timey Monday night. Kings Insider from Sactown Sports. Great guy, great writer, Brenden Nunes. How are you today, Brenden?
I'm doing good, Whitey. Refresh my memory. When did I big time you?
Oh, when we were eating Monday, and I says, hey, how you doing? You want a cookie? You're like, I'm fine. Yeah, it's like, you don't want me to get you any cookie. You don't remember that?
Oh, you didn't engage.
I didn't hear the "Do you want a cookie" part. I just heard. I heard "How are you doing?" and that was the end.
I know. I'm just kidding.
You know,
I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I said, "How are you?" Like, you want a cookie? He's like, "Yeah, I'm good." So anyway, Brenden, I kid. Thanks for joining us here, Brenden. What do you make of this? Nick Stauskas going after Kessler Edwards. Where did that come from?
You know, honestly, I was tuning in right before I hopped in here, and that was news to me. I missed it last night, and yeah, I mean, I think you guys covered it pretty well. If there's anybody that should not be saying something, it's probably Nick Stauskas.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, there's it's not necessary. It's very unnecessary, and it's the most random shot. Like, just say some players, whatever. Keep it vague. Clearly, he doesn't care about what people are going to think about that.
Right. And then no disrespect, but this guy doesn't belong to the league. So,
that always is followed up with disrespect.
With disrespect.
Yes.
Sauce Castillo might have been sauced last night, boys.
Yes.
So let me just say
that.
Brenden, let me ask you there, as we dive into this Kings, I need to know where you stand, big fella. You know, there's a camp out there that, you know, this team is wrecked. You know, they should tear it down. They should tank, you know, trade off all the assets, player assets, build for the future. Where do you stand at on the current state of the Sacramento Kings?
It's complicated, I guess. I mean, I think that part of it. I'll answer your question. I'll answer your question. If it was me, I think that the tear it down route is the right way to go. I just say that it's complicated because I don't even think that is like a genuine option for this team. You know, I think that they want to remain competitive, and I somewhat get that with the history of the organization. But me personally, I think that you need a number one. Not that De'Aaron was, but I thought that he was your closest thing, and then you got rid of that. And so now how do you find it? And the answer is through the draft. And so to me, like, that's the hardest piece. And I think that that's the direction that I would go. But given that this is the way that they're moving, I think, you know, if we're talking long-term here, it's going to be interesting to see what they do this offseason. Like, you know, talks of Kevin Durant trades, and that was floated around a little bit at the deadline. I don't think that the Kings can get into that conversation really, but point being, I think that they're going to try, you know, and it's tough to figure out who the matching salary is. I think that DeMar DeRozan is probably the most likely one that we're talking about in these sort of scenarios. So, you know, I think they have one more big swing in them to try and, I guess, go get that number one and try to make this roster work. But honestly, I'm not the most optimistic about how that may turn out.
Brenden, here's why I am not in favor of that. And I understand everything you said. And, you know, trying to take the emotion out of it. I have a feeling you may get some emotion from my partner here in a minute. I don't know. We'll see. But I understand the logic. But seeing Charlotte play, and then, you know, tonight we got Utah. It's so bleak when teams do tear it down. And you didn't use the tank word. I'm gonna use it. And you know, you're at least 3 years of just desolation. And to me, I don't want any part of that. I don't think Kings fans want any part of that. And that's why, even though there's some logic to what you say,
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I get where you're coming from. I think that my counter a little bit would be, sorry if I cut you off. I think my audio got a little weird there. I think that my counter would be that, you know, OKC was in that spot previously, and they rebounded since, obviously, by going through that process. And, you know, it feels like the Kings never fully committed to that process. Like, yes, you did with the Marvin Bagley route, but if you get it wrong, you got to stay there and keep trying and not try to fast track it, in my mind. And Houston, you know, really bleeds for a little while, and eventually you come out on the other side. So I think that, you know, in my mind, the other aspect of that is that the Kings have been mediocre for 15 years. And I think that 3 to 4 years of being really bad for the ideal payoff. is kind of just the trade-off there. But I think that your point definitely makes sense. And I think that that's the reason that they don't have a willingness to reset, which I get. I mean, to be blunt, like I didn't go through these, 17, 16 years that a lot of this fan base did. So I'm aware that I don't have that perspective and that it might feel a lot different if I did. But again, yeah, attempting to take the emotion out of it. I think that I'm big on either, fully commit to the goal should be an eventual championship. And it's not that it isn't for this team, but you have to be realistic that you need a number one option. And to me, the only way to get that is through the draft.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna push back on the notion that they didn't fully tank. I'm looking at the Kings draft history right here, and fully. You don't always have to have the number one pick to become a champion. Where was Giannis drafted? Where was Jokic drafted? Where was Steph Curry drafted? Where was Kawhi Leonard drafted? It's not just about the number one pick. I look at the Kings' history, number 7, Bismack, Thomas Robinson, McLemore, Stauskas. I'm of the belief here, Brenden, is, sure, you want to have more cracks at it. I get that. But whatever pick you have, just get the damn pick right. We wouldn't be in this situation if they got the picks right over the last 15 years. I'm of that belief. And so I still believe there's a path forward where you don't have to rip it down to the studs, because you could argue, Whitey talked about this. Denver didn't have to rip it down to the studs. Milwaukee didn't have to rip it down to the studs to get a champion. I'm looking at teams that have actually tanked and done that. OKC ain't won a damn thing. You know what I mean? Utah hasn't won anything. So I think there's this narrative that only way to build a champion is to rip it down to the studs, and that's not true. You look at it. Look at the past champions. And Whitey brought up the Celtics, back in 2012-13 when they traded Kevin Garnett and Pierce as their way of ripping it down, but that only lasted 1 year.
Yeah, I think that that's fair. I will say, I think with Giannis and Jokic, that those are like kind of the definition of outliers in my mind. But to the point that you have, they had good cracks at it. But I think that when you get them wrong, don't try to pretend like you got it right. You know what I mean? And then fast tracking the process in that way. And so it doesn't necessarily have to mean to the studs. Like you could keep some young dudes around. And to your point, Draper, I think back to, I'm forgetting who the Kings ended up with in this draft class, but when they lost the coin flip and they could have had Franz Wagner. And to me, that changes the entire dynamic of this team. Not that he's a number one, but just thank you. Yes. And look at where we're at now, so there are little things that could change everything. But I think that if you get to that draft point and you're not hitting, then don't at some point be like, gosh, we have to get out of this. We need to get back to the playoffs, because then cool, the 16-17 year drought is fine and in the rear view, but how long until we're talking about it's been one time in 20 years, and then that's just a new conversation. And not that this team can't make the postseason, but I have the thought of when the post-game show was going on after that Laker game yesterday, they're showing the broadcast. How much different would this team feel if the play-in didn't exist? And I get that I'm making up a prior scenario here, but that used to be the case, obviously. And I just think this is a team in the 10th seed right now, and you're a little bit further. You're not that far from climbing up, but this is it's a tough spot to be in. And I think that some of these additions are nice. I think we're going to see Zach continue, not the 42 that he just had, obviously, but continue to get more comfortable and produce here. I like Jake LaRavia. We'll see what happens this offseason. Jonas, all that stuff. It's just, maybe I'm too championship or nothing when it comes down to it at the very end of that should be your goal. And again, not that it's not, but I just, it's hard for this to not be a bleak outlook in my mind, to be honest, if we're looking long term, right?
Brenden, I got a question for you based on what I thought was a really good follow-up by you. And I'm talking about post-game Monday, and, we're all sitting there, and Doug Christie goes over the box score, and he's talking about, well, this was good. We got to work on this. And then he goes into the 38 threes. That's a little light because my new number is 50. And I was just my head was spinning, and I believe it was you who followed up and asked him how he got to that number 50. And he kind of, if I remember right, he didn't answer you directly, but what did you think of, first of all, what do you think of 50 as the target for threes, and his response to what I believe was your question?
Yeah, it was. And apologies if my network's being a little bit weird over here, but it blew my mind too, Whitey. I honestly had a different question, and I'm holding the mic, and he finishes his thing, and I'm like, did he just say 50? Like, it's. I think that would be an NBA record. It's a ridiculous amount to aim for. Not that this team couldn't do it. It just caught me off guard because previously he was saying 40. Now the new number has changed to 50. And you're right, he didn't really answer the question. He was like, it's just based on my own calculations, like not any analytics or anything. Yeah. And so whatever. I mean, the team has a lot of good 3-point shooters, and it seems like the big things right now that they're trying to continue to improve on are 3-point shooting, spacing, and turnovers. But yeah, it perked my ears up too. 50. God.
Hey, Brenden, I'm looking at the construction of the roster, and I see Zach LaVine going off for 42. We know what DeMar DeRozan is. Do we have a 1A and a 1B situation here going in Sacramento? And how far do you think they can take us? Or do we need Zach to be the guy and everybody fill in? How do you see this playing out these last 25?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally DeMar at this point in his career, like you can have him obviously be that clutch guy late in games. You can have him be the dude in the fourth quarter. And then there's going to be, one or two other stretches earlier in the game where he just rallies off 8 straight, when he gets a rhythm, when he sees a favorable matchup. But I think it needs to be Zach LaVine more often than not. And then obviously you can have your nights from Malik Monk. I think will give you close to 20 on it on any given night, obviously, and see what Keegan and Domas give you and some of these other guys as well. But to me, I think it needs to be like throughout the majority of the game, the Zach LaVine show. And I think, and obviously playing within the flow of everything and all of this, but then you can have your little spurts from DeRozan, from Malik, but you get to that closing minutes, and that's where you have to go to DeMar in my mind. And I think that having Zach and a lot of these other guys should make it easier for him to conserve himself for having those scoring in bunches and then closing games out.
Yeah, that's Brenden Nunes, of course, one of our Kings insiders for Sactown Sports. Brenden, I wanted to ask you about this bench. In your lifetime, have you ever seen a Kings bench with this much talent? I don't know if it's a good bench. It could be, but as far as the talent and the number of guys that are legitimate NBA players, I mean, I was thinking about it, and I go way, way back, probably to before you were conscious of basketball. Can you remember a time when the Kings had a bench with this much depth?
The year that they signed Corey Joseph, Trevor Ariza, and Dwayne Dedmon, I was excited coming into the year, but I think we know how that one went. Yeah. I mean, not that I can think of, Whitey. Maybe like when Bogey was on the bench, I think there were some okay moments. But no, I mean, I think that how well-rounded this bench does a lot. Like you have size, you have physicality. I think you have versatility when it comes to just positionally. I'm interested a lot in what Markelle Fultz can bring to this team as he starts to get more comfortable, not having played a game in so long and taking the time to rework his body and everything. The shot looks a little bit different, I thought, and that's something he worked on in this off time. So no, I mean, I think the depth of it, and I didn't even mention Jonas, and obviously he's a huge piece. I think extremely consistent. That's probably the biggest improvement in my mind with this bench is that when Domas came off the floor, their offense fell off a cliff. It was their best offense with him on the floor and their worst with him off. And now Jonas so far is about 1 point above their offensive rating average throughout the course of the season when he's on the floor. I think that, you're not falling off a cliff and in that same way. So to answer your question, probably the best bench that I can think of off the top of my mind.
Most talented. We'll see how good it ends up being. Yeah, I'm with you.
Right.
I'm with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Brenden, when you look at, the rest of the season, I see this team 2 games out of the 6th spot. I look at it and people will be like, Drapes, you're pie in the sky. You're a team guy, rah, sis, boom, ba, and all of that. But considering they traded their best player, they fired their coach, I'm sort of optimistic that, or at least things could be a whole lot worse than what they really are right now. I mean, I'm looking at it like you're 2 games out, and I know the schedule is tough going forward. But considering all of that, where would you expect this Kings team to be right now? And do you think it has underachieved when you consider all that has happened this season?
I feel like it's hard to say that they haven't underachieved. And I get what you're saying, but it's not necessarily like they're blameless in everything that did take place throughout the course of this season. And I think the range that we're talking about, I mean, they're 2 games, but I know I was just talking about them being in 10th and that looking bleak. They're technically 2 games behind 6th, which is reasonable to catch up in the amount of time they have left. I just also look at the teams above them, and in Dallas, questionable based on their health. Obviously, I think Golden State is a lot better since they got Jimmy Butler. Minnesota, we'll see. The Clippers, there's some question marks surrounding those teams, and you got Phoenix right below you at 11th, who obviously has been really sputtering here. But it's hard to differentiate where they're sort of at within this group for me. And I think it's towards the lower part of that. I think we're talking 8 to 10, probably in my mind, for what they have. And it's to get that postseason experience, I guess, has a benefit. And there's a world where you get a matchup that ends up working out in your favor, and like you're competitive in the first round, and then things feel a lot better going into this offseason. I'm not saying I'm betting on that, but I think that there is a world. And so we'll see. I think that a lot of the rest of this year is about getting everybody comfortable with one another. And, I don't think it's an excuse that they have to deal with that. I think it's what you signed up for when you decided to make all these moves at the deadline. So I think that that's the complicated aspect here. But the biggest thing to me is, I think Jonas, Jake will fit in fairly smooth. Markelle, like, it's easier when you're filling a role. It's really about Zach LaVine and I think Malik Monk, for the most part, of 2 guys that they're leaders of this team as primary ball handlers and creators, and how they have to figure out how to mesh together now. Malik Monk has 10 assists in that last game, but he also has 5 turnovers. And like, that's a learning process for him, being the primary guy there. And I think having that big Zach LaVine game gives me a lot more confidence moving forward, because I feel like he needed that breakthrough, and they had been pushing him like, dude, we need you to be yourself when you're fitting in. I mean, honestly, he's not providing what he should be in his best form, obviously. So makes me a little optimistic that they can be a good enough offense to cause some troubles, but they still have the same defensive question marks that I feel like they've had for, I don't know how long.
Check out his, I'm done with this witness, Mr. Draper. Did you have any more questions? Any further questions?
Because I'm gonna go at Brenden, but I'm gonna save it for another day. I'll save it for another day.
Go ahead, Draper. I got time.
Because I'm looking at the situation here. Ideally, this Atlanta Hawks pick conveys, right, this year. Ideally, the Hawks get this selection this year. Then next year, we have our own first rounder. 2027, we have 2 first rounders. And so I don't think the cupboards are as bare as a lot of people make it out to be. I think it's vitally important, Brenden, that this Hawks pick conveys this year. Ideally, if you can get in the top 4 or 5, whatever, I get that. I understand. So you can keep that. But I don't want pick number 12 in this year's draft. Like, to move forward and to have those assets and those shots at those draft picks that you talk about, it has to convey this year, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because you could fall into a scenario where it conveys this year, and what if you're 10th, 11th pick next year, and then that ends up going to them because the protections fall from top 12 this year to top 10 next year, which I guess most ideal scenario is you're above that the whole time, and then it eventually turns into 2 seconds, right?
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely most ideal. Like, to your point, they have first rounders, and like that Minnesota first is probably the most valuable, and if you go down to their own 2030, like, you think teams around the league are going to value that far out Sacramento first, so I think that they can try to take another big swing, like I was saying earlier, this offseason. It's just about, it's relative to the market, right? And
you mean really by trade? Is that what you're talking about? Big swing trade wise?
You have to, yes. But you have to have the best offer, obviously. Right. And like, again, KD pie in the sky, you're never going to beat out OKC if OKC has any sort of interest. You know what I mean? So I think that's why sometimes they've ended up in these weird scenarios where it's like, if you look at it from just Sacramento's perspective, it's like, oh, they could make a good package. But then sometimes it's like, yeah, but is it better than what these other teams are? Right. And there's, I think that it's just a question, not saying that I have strong feelings either way. But to your point, I do agree. I think that they have decent draft capital to work with now, and that was a big part of the decision in moving off De'Aaron Fox. And obviously, some of those seconds are the reason they were even able to acquire Jake LaRavia, Jonas Valanciunas in the first place.
Mm-hmm. All right, Brenden. For great Kings coverage, if you're not already, follow him on X and check him out. Check out his Kings coverage, SactownSports.com. Thanks for your time, Brenden. Enjoy the game. We'll talk to you soon.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
All right, Brenden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Woo. He was on the hot seat today, Drapes. You had him on the hot seat.
Not just for me. I'm looking at the text line and YouTube, man. They coming at his neck. And here's the thing, Whitey. The reason why I say you want to convey this pick now, because that opens you up to be able to trade your future picks, to be able to trade your pick in 2026, to be able to trade your pick in 2027 if you need to. And so if you don't convey it now, then you can't trade your 2026 pick. You can't trade your own 2027 pick. Then the assets shrink